Well, hello, everybody. It is January the 31st, 2025. The Line podcast starts right now, and we've got lots of stuff to talk about. Liberal leadership and evolution on taxation policy and the carbon tax. What Mark Carney is proposing he'll do, we'll get into that. We're going to talk the Foreign Interference Commission and how a great many people were disappointed by the outcome. Obviously, we're going to talk developing news that's happening as we sit down to record this right out of the White House that obviously is going to matter for all Canadians. And we're going to do it while I have the norovirus and potentially a concussion, and Jen is recovering from full sedation for dental surgery. So this is going to be a very special episode of the Line podcast. All that and hopefully not that much more coming up.
This episode of the Line podcast has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and increasing regulations, today nearly 4 million Canadians still smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco, vaping products, and oral smokeless pot products provide a potentially less harmful choice. Smoke-free alternatives do not involve combustion or burning like smoking a cigarette does. Instead of heavily restricting access and information about these options, Canada's government should be adopting common sense legislation that will further bring down Canada's smoking rates and put information in the hands of Canadians. Information such as the relative risks compared to cigarettes. Because the products are not the same, and they shouldn't be treated the same. It's just common sense. Learn about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at unsmoke.ca. Yeah, well, this is the problem. We're victims of our own success here, Matt, because no, we can't actually take a week off.
We can take a week off if we plan a week off.
We plan a week off, but we can't stop. So do you want to talk about your drama over the last 48 hours or mine?
Well, yesterday, I'm out in public and I sit down in a chair and the chair disintegrates. I don't mean it broke. I mean, someone had either been wiggling on it, maybe a kid, or someone had, to be a dick, had, moved the screws. The thing just folded like a house of cards under me. And I did a somersault backward onto concrete and my head took the impact. So I was a lot smarter yesterday. The level of my commentary is going to be down this week. And I get into bed last night and I'm thinking, this sucks. 40 some odd year old bodies don't take sudden impact with concrete as well as I might have before. So I was sore. I was grumpy. I was stiff. But I'm like, at least I'm in bed. I'm in bed early. I'm going to have a great night's sleep. And at just before 5 a.m, the norovirus bug that had been striking down everyone around me but had completely missed me found me. So Jen was scrambling this morning to find out possible replacement hosts for me because I couldn't get out of bed. But the thing is, with noro, it hits you like a bolt from the blue.
Yeah.
So
you might be okay, or you might be taking a sudden barf break and we might be coming back with a new host. We'll see which way this goes.
Even if the barf breaks happen on longer intervals, I'm okay with that. But because between about 5 a.m. and 10 a.m, I was a write-off. And then by about 11, I was starting to think, hey, you know what? I'm starting to feel a bit better. Around noon, I was able to actually eat something. And here we go. So let's see what happens.
Let's see how that goes.
And how are you feeling?
No, I mean, so I had been put, for people who have not been following the saga of me and the dentist, I stopped taking proper care of myself about the time my son was born. I think this is a pretty common mom problem. And while I ensure that my kids are getting to the dentist every 6 months or so, I basically didn't bother for a fairly astonishing amount of time. I was just taking really good care of myself at home. And so I finally, after a couple of years, realized it had been a couple of years since I'd gone to the dentist. Go to the dentist, get a cleaning. My teeth were in better shape than anyone was expecting. But fillings that I had done 15 years ago had reached the end of their life cycle. So I had to get quite a little, not huge work, but stuff done. And I'm chicken shit when it comes to the dentist. Like I don't love it. I do not love it. And so I went to the dentist and I said, well, okay, look, I get it. You have to do the thing. It's not a root canal, but it's almost there. Just letting you know, like there's a non-zero chance that I may have a panic attack in the middle of you doing this. And can we prevent that, please? And he was like, okay, so we'll give you the sedation stuff. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Ativan ain't going to cut it. You're going to have to knock me out. And he's like, oh, okay. So I had to go through a couple of dentists until finally I got the full sedation experience, which involved like the horse pill, like reality is going to bend for you things. And then on top of that, I also got the laughing gas. Because that shit's just fun. So anyway, I went through like 4 canisters of laughing gas for this work that I had to do, and like $200 worth of uncovered laughing gas surgery, in addition to the pills. And I get out of it, and of course, my husband has to drive me home because I'm out of it. And I'm like, I want chicken and waffles. I want to go to my favorite restaurant and get the chicken and the waffles. And he's like, Are you sure? Can you eat food? I'm like, I want chicken and waffles.
It's a bold food choice coming off of anesthesia.
Yeah, pretty much. Anyway, so he had to actually carry me to the car because, of course, I had all the surgery done on one side, which screwed up my inner ear, which means I kept on tipping over to the right. He's carrying me to the car. I fall asleep in the car. He pulls into the restaurant. I'm asleep. He wakes me up and he's like, are you sure you don't want to go home, honey? I'm like, chicken and waffles. So the poor waitress serves us chicken and waffles. She must have assumed that I was high as a kite. But anyway, I got my chicken and waffles. I went home. I fell asleep and I don't remember like the last 48 hours. So if anything, if I contacted you or you contacted me via phone, please presume that I have no memory of that. And 2, if any news happened sort of between early Wednesday and now, it's a crapshoot as to whether or not it's stuck in my brain.
Well, everybody, that's it for this episode of the Line Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I think between the two of us, we have one mostly functional human being. So honestly, I've seen podcasts make do with less. So let's go into it.
All right.
So let's talk about a little divide and conquer we did this week. I previously had been quite tuned in on foreign interference. I had other stuff going on this week. Honestly, business stuff. On early next week, we're launching finally for real On the Line, our second podcast. Woo. So that's been most of what I've been doing. So you did the heavy lifting on the Hope Commission report. I have read the news stories about it. And one of the things I find interesting was people who are completely ignoring one of Paul Well's rule of Canadian politics, which is that all things being equal, the less interesting thing will happen. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who had been very loud and public with it were expecting, excuse me, there to be some explosive revelation about Pierre Poilievre or his family. And there wasn't. There were some criticisms of him, and I think warranted criticisms. But in terms of a shocking revelation, no.
No. So let's talk about the really big picture that come out of the foreign interference inquiry. And that is nothing, if you've been following this, if you've been following us writing about this, nothing about the actual final inquiry is going to surprise you in the slightest. The inquiry overwhelmingly, and I think that this is broadly supported, demonstrated that yes, there were attempts at foreign interference. However, none of that foreign interference fundamentally changed the outcome of any election. It may have played a role in a couple of nominations, but the overall democratic integrity of our system is intact. And by the way, I think both of us, looking at the evidence that we have before us, would come to the same conclusion. Like for those of you who are convinced that the Liberals have been totally bought off by China, or that Pierre Poilievre has some dark secret connection to Modi or something, and that this undermines the capacity of our state to function at a legitimate level, you people are out to lunch. There's just not a lot of evidence for that. The inquiry did go into some specifics that have been in the news, particularly around Handong. I want to get into that a little bit. That being said, even though I don't disagree with Justice Hoag's overall conclusions personally, I don't think that the overall report is very strong. And I'm going to get into why I think that's the case. Firstly, And I think fundamentally it has to do with a cultural issue that Canada has around transparency, and a cultural issue that this country has around using concepts like national security and defining national security so incredibly broadly that stuff that really should be public information and public knowledge and made public so that adults can assess it for themselves just aren't. Canadians have like this really deeply technocratic, anti-democratic bend to us, where we actually do just on some level want some experts to make decisions for us and take care of us and figure it out for us. And this is one of the major cultural differences about how Canadian governance functions versus American governance, right? And you see this at pretty much every level, from how local police forces operate to how upper functions of government operate. So I think that my overall takeaway from all of this is that the fundamental problem with the foreign inquiry interference is that, by its own admission, it was coming to its conclusions based on like documents which were 80% classified, which means it's coming to its conclusions based on overwhelmingly on evidence that, or testimony that was happening in camera, which means we didn't have access to it, or documents that were classified, so we didn't have access to it. So intelligent, informed citizens, journalists, whomever, can't check Justice Hoag's work. We have no capacity to do that because the evidence that she is basing these conclusions on is not and will never be made available to us under the aegis of national security. And the problem that I have with that is that I just fundamentally do not trust our federal government apparatus to be making rational decisions about what should be kept secret under the aegis of national security and what they don't. They've lost that trust from me.
They've abused it before. Like, this isn't hypothetical. They've abused
That's right. They've abused it before. And I just think that there is a cultural sort of unwillingness to treat Canadian citizens like adults who can handle evidence, like actual evidence, and come to their own conclusions about things. And we've seen before that for however talented Justice Hoag may be personally, or she's above reproach, I don't doubt her integrity, but I do know that people of good faith and goodwill can look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions. Because that's how things work in the world. That's the reality. So because like so much of this stuff just simply what has been made public, by the way, isn't flattering to the government, and what hasn't been made public disallows us from making intelligent and informed conclusions, I'm left with this situation where fundamentally, I mean, the way that I kind of wrote it down in my notes here is that there's a just trust me approach to government transparency. It's don't worry, everybody. This great Justice Hoag has seen all the documents, interviewed all the people, and she says things are mostly fine. But of course, none of us can be trusted to actually read the transcripts of those interviews or examine the evidence. We just have to trust her because she's a representative of the institution we're supposed to trust. And it just goes back to this really inherent Canadian blind spot where people in positions of power in institutions assume that, and who are facing the erosion of trust in institutions, think that the answer to the problem is just to lecture people to trust them harder.
Yeah.
When in fact the answer is no, you need to demonstrate more transparency to show us that we can trust you harder. And that's a problem from my perspective. I think it's a cultural problem. I think it's an overwhelming problem. And then we get into
problem. It's been a problem repeatedly during the foreign interference issue, right?
Yes,
because
absolutely.
First we had media leaks, we had Globe and Mail reporting, we had Global News reporting, and then the Prime Minister said nothing here. And then we had eminent Canadian David Johnson with the Johnson Report telling nothing's here. And then now we have the Hoag Commission. And one of the, I was talking with a friend about this yesterday. He's a smart guy. He, as you said a minute ago, reasonable people can disagree on the evidence. But he was telling me all the evidence to date tells us that there isn't a serious problem here and that the media torqued it. And I said, no, all the evidence to date is that we're being told by the people who are inside the operation that they think they did really well. And so you've read a lot of the Hoag Commission report. I know you're still working your way through it. I did read the Johnson report. I hate myself that much. I read it cover to cover. And as I wrote at the time, the government's own version of events was a confession of astonishing incompetence.
Yes.
And if the ultimate conclusion of it is that no serious damage is done, that's luck. That's not talent. That's not right. Energy. That's not right. Skill. That's not focus and initiative. It's luck.
Yeah, and there is one thing that I did want to rant about when it came to Hoag's Commission, because there was a whole section in there that was very, how shall I say, smarmy and a little bit lectury about the evils of media leaks. there was this whole sense of media leaks are illegal and dangerous without seeming to understand that most of the information that we do have and can assess our judgment about the integrity of our democratic system have come about, including the inquiry itself, have come about as a result of media leaks. Look, I understand why people who are technocrats and who are in government really don't like media leaks because they don't like to have their judgment fundamentally questioned. But whether you like them or not, or whether or not they're illegal, in any democratic system, leaks to the government and whistleblowers to media serve as a fundamental stopgap. Maybe the last possible method of recourse for people who fear that something is going wrong that shouldn't be. Okay, so I really did not like that section about, well, yes, I do realize that we're having this inquiry and I've literally been hired to look into this, but still the leaks that led to this inquiry were suspect. I'm like, F you? I mean, like, that's all I have to say about that, just F you. There's also a bit of a smarmy section about intelligence and the limits of intelligence and what intelligence is, which read to me more like, once again, Justice Hogue lecturing to adult citizens about how they should weigh evidence, but being unwilling to provide that evidence themselves, because there's an assumption that that people can't be trusted to deal with real information.
They keep us in the dark and then criticize us for being uninformed.
That's correct, yes. And I'm sitting here going like, no, I understand that intelligence isn't perfect and that intelligence can be wrong and that there are issues around source trust and source reliability and credibility because I'm a grown-up. That's not an excuse to keep all this secret under the aegis of national security. That's just isn't an excuse, particularly when we're talking about documents and classified documents that have effectively already been leaked in whole or in part. So I just didn't find that compelling. I want to get into the actual recommendations for the inquiry because I think that the recommendations are what's going to take this from being kind of a weak report to a total write-off in the minds of most people. But first, I want to talk about a little bit about some of the stuff around Handong. I mean, we've written about Handong quite a lot. If you want to go back and search www.readtheline, you can see what we had to say. One of the quotes, and again, I'm quoting directly from the report here, Liberal Party representatives told Jeremy Broadpurse, the national campaign director of the Liberal Party, about the allegations of busing. So this was allegations, for example, that foreign actors were involved with busing people who may or may not have been Canadian citizens to a nomination vote for Handong.
Yeah, ballot box stuffing.
Ballot box stuffing, essentially. So again, this didn't interfere in the actual final election. We're talking about nomination battles, and nomination battles are a very different kettle of fish than the actual election. But anyway, I'll go back to the report. Mr. Broadhurst brought this information to the attention of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in his capacity as Liberal leader. So we now have it absolutely on the record without equivocation that concerns about Handong, his nomination, and all the rest were brought to Justin Trudeau. And I would really encourage people to look at that quote directly from the inquiry, which, by the way, was not a particularly scathing inquiry, and compare that to the actual quotes from Justin Trudeau when he was directly asked about whether or not he had been briefed about Handong. Because when Justin Trudeau was directly asked, have you been briefed about foreign interference in relation to Handong, or some version of that quote, the deflection, the attempts to sort of cast any question of that nature as being evidence of anti-Asian racism were egregious. Not only were they egregious, but they were totally unnecessary. Because all Justin Trudeau had to ever say about this was, yes, I've been briefed about Handong from multiple different sources. I've examined the evidence. I've decided that they didn't warrant action on my part at the time. That's all he had to say, and instead he decided to go on long, extensive rants, basically making it sound like anybody asking these questions or posing these concerns was racist. And to me, that's just totally egregious. And the fact that Hogue has not pointed this out and has gone on and how should I say this, had an entire report that tries to dismiss concerns about foreign interference as some form of like disinformation campaign, and yet is refusing to call out the Prime Minister on his own attempts at disinformation, which is what I call that, to me is really, really suspect, and to me does raise questions about Hogue's impartiality and her credibility here. The second thing that I think that I want to point out from the report that really stuck out for me was one of the allegations raised against MP Dong. And again, I want to be careful about this because Dong has proceeded to engage in lawsuits against many of the organizations who have reported on this from him. So I don't want to get myself into hot trouble from a libel point of view. I'm just reporting directly from what it was said in the report. And again, I'm quoting here. According to a government summary of intelligence relating to Mr. Dong that was made public, Mr. Dong would, the allegations, just in case you don't remember, was that Dong was essentially briefing members of, I believe, the Chinese consulate about...
In Toronto, yeah.
In Toronto, about the Michaels. Remember Michael Spavor and Michael Covering, who were detained in China under dubious pretexts after we arrested Meng Wanzhou from Huawei. So they were kept detained for, I think, more than a year, weren't they? If I'm recalling correctly, before they were finally released. So Mr. Dong went to the consulate in some capacity. We don't know what capacity. He was briefing the Chinese consulate in Toronto about the two Michaels who were at that point still being detained by the Chinese government. Was he doing that on behalf of the Prime Minister's office, or was he doing that because he had decided to just be helpful? We don't know. Secondly, the fact that he was there and having that conversation in the first place is, to me, absolute red alert, regardless of what the specifics of what he advised the consulate at the time. So what it was reported in media was that, and what Dong has decided to sue the media over, is the allegation that he, I think, essentially advised the consulate not to release the Michaels due for political considerations. Now, Dong has disputed that and said, no, that's not what I said. And what complicates the matter is that this conversation apparently was happening in Mandarin. It sounds to me like CSIS was overhearing this conversation, but they perhaps paraphrased a conversation from Mandarin in the classified report, and then the classified report was then essentially sent to the Prime Minister's office and then leaked. Okay? So because the conversation wasn't transcribed word for word, it's impossible for us now to know exactly what he said. But according to Hogue, and this is again a quote from the inquiry, precision and nuance can be lost in translation. Based on the information available to me, I cannot assess the accuracy of the public summary, but I can say that the classified information corroborates Mr. Dong's denial of the allegation that he suggested the PRC should hold off on releasing Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor. He did not suggest the PRC extend their detention, again, according to the paraphrased classified document. The problem here is that what she does acknowledge is that essentially there was some kind of a conversation that perhaps was lost in translation. But I'm willing to accept that according to the classified document, Mr. Dong did not explicitly say you should maintain their detention. But it does kind of sound, according to the report, like he did have a conversation about whether or not releasing them would, quote unquote, be viewed as by opposition parties as an affirmation of the effectiveness of a hardline Canadian approach. So we're threading a pretty fine needle here in an attempt to discredit the media reporting about this. And I still just come back to my original point. Even if we don't know precisely what Mr. Dong said to those members of the Chinese consulate, what the hell was he doing there having a conversation about two Michaels in detention in the first place? Who was he?
I don't have an answer for that.
I don't have whose orders was he acting on? And if he wasn't acting on the Prime Minister's orders, isn't that in and of itself a problem? Isn't it in and of itself a problem that an MP would go to the Chinese consulate and decide to freelance on a matter like that? As I said, do I think that is evidence that he's a traitor? No, not at all. But I think it should raise some pretty significant questions. And I think that he deserves to answer those questions without obfuscating about, oh, well, you just didn't understand the translation. Because it seems like a lot of basic facts that are not in dispute should raise some interesting questions. So I don't know if you want to go on that. But I want to talk about the final stuff. Let me make a comment on Dong.
Yeah, okay. I'll make a comment on Dong that will not get us sued.
Okay.
I think your take is very reasonable. I think it was wise of you to read directly from the report. Mm-hmm. And as you were saying at the very beginning, The ability for the Prime Minister to say, I reviewed the material concerning Mr. Dong and I did not consider it to be actionable, is not something you and I dreamed up months later. That was our immediate response after the press conference the Prime Minister gave in Toronto, which was, at the time, it seemed like an unnecessarily big position for him to take when he could have taken a much safer position. One of the things that I find interesting, and I will say no more than that, was in the immediate aftermath of all of this, there were hordes of liberals lining up to defend Mr. Dong, to say he will be vindicated and one day he will return to the Liberal caucus. And then somewhere around the time, I think, of the Johnston report, that stopped. It just stopped. And I'm not accusing Mr. Dong of anything. I don't have the grounds to do that. But I do think all of us can see that the Prime Minister himself went from a position of we've got hands back and this is anti-Asian racism to, during some of his testimony for Hogue, he could barely mention his name. Oh, I remember the individual in meetings about him. Like the tone changed in a big way. And I don't know what that means. I don't know. It could just be legal advice, but it was interesting. So Mr. Dong is now continuing his lawsuits, I believe, against Global News and reporter Sam Cooper. I don't know if those are a combined action or a separate actions. But anyway, they continue. Now that we have likely all the evidence we're going to have, I don't know what the resolution of that's going to be. But I'll be curious to see. And I'll leave it at that.
So I think we should talk a little bit about some of what was discussed when it comes to Pierre Poilievre and the decision by Pierre not to engage in to get the security clearance that would fundamentally be required for him to get better access to this information, and the excuses that he's offered as a result of that. Firstly, I would like to point out that just as I think that there are lots of conspiracy theories about a lot of foreign interference swirling around on the right, this is a conspiracy theory that swirls around on the left. There is this assumption that because Pierre has refused to get the security clearance, that this is evidence that he's suspect, that he's bought off, that his wife's bought off. I mean, I've heard every conspiracy theory under the sun.
Her dad had, it was
exactly.
Wild.
There's no evidence for any of these. I can see no evidence for any of this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I believe Pierre previously did have security clearance, but he chose to rescind it. And
that's why a lot of the conspiracy theories circle around his wife.
Yeah.
Because when Poilievre was a member of the former Harper government, he was not yet married. He married his wife in more recent years.
That's right.
So in some of the steamier parts of the internet, the speculation has been he's compromised through her.
Yeah,
or there's something going on there, or it's a family thing, or there's something shady going on. And I'm not talking just random name, bunch of numbers, Twitter accounts. There are people with large public profiles in media and even in politics who were way out there on Pierre Poilievre is going to be ruined by the Hogue Commission report. Doug Ford will be airdropped in as the new leader of the Conservative Party. It's like it will. And
they say like there's Trudeau derangement syndrome is absolutely a thing.
So is Poilievre derangement.
So is Poilievre derangement syndrome. There's no evidence for any of this. There's none at all. And in fact, Poilievre's own, like, we can criticize Poilievre's decision to not get the security clearance, and I think that you do, and I think you and I have different takes on this or different positions on this. I think it's completely fair game to criticize him on this. But I would also point out there's a lot of people in official liberaldom who wink and nod to this conspiracy theory by talking about Pierre's conspiracy. And they don't go as far as to say, well, the wife is blah, 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 blah. But they wink and nod to this stuff, and they feed into it. And they know.
What are you afraid of, Pierre? What are you hiding?
Yeah, exactly. Look, Pierre's argument for not getting the security clearance is that in order to get the security clearance, you have to take an oath to stay silent about what you discover in the process of being briefed. And this essentially puts a muzzle around his mouth, and it changes his ability to effectively criticize the government as opposition leader. I think he's right. And the reason why I think he's right goes back to the fundamental cultural problems that we were talking about at the top of this podcast. We know that this is a government that has a habit of overclassifying information. We know that this is a government that has a habit of hiding information that really has no reason to stay hidden under the aegis of national security. Like, there is a culture of this. There's a culture of anti-transparency in this country. And there has been for years, and it's been getting worse for years. So do I think that the liberals are using politics to weaponize security clearance in order to hide stuff that they have done wrong so that Pierre can't, under oath, criticize them for it? Yes, I believe that's a very reasonable concern. I think he's right. And frankly, if Pierre comes to power and blows apart a lot of this stuff and implements a lot more transparency, a much easier flow of information, I think that is a very necessary corrective.
He won't.
Maybe he won't. Maybe he won't. Hey,
I've been waiting all my life for someone to.
I can't criticize the guy for actions that he doesn't have the power to take yet. I can only say I hope he does. So, like, look, sure. I think that it's perfectly reasonable, and other people have different takes on this. Other people say, you're opposition leader, you're adult, stop whining, get your security clearance, you need this, you need to be able to do this. And I understand where those people are coming from, and I think that good reasonable people of good faith can disagree on this point. Mm-hmm. And I think you probably will. I have no problem with him not getting the security clearance, and I think his logic for not getting the security clearance, seeing everything that I've seen, is reasonable. I'm hoping that he fundamentally changes a lot of the cultural issues around classification and secrecy to allow information to flow much more easily and freely, not only within government, because we've seen that as being a big problem, but also between government and citizens. Like, yep. Citizens can't keep their governments reasonably accountable if they don't have enough information to do so.
Which is why the government's ever so slowly winch off the supply of information, and
that's right.
We're left all voting on vibes. I vibe this guy. I vibe that guy.
Yep, that's right.
What about observed performance? We don't even have the data.
We don't even have the data on observed performance.
But what we have is a Twitter account who tweets memes we like.
Yep, and that's right. And it reduces the quality of. It's deliberate. It's completely.
We've lobotomized ourselves, is how I've described it before.
We have. So anyway, that's just kind of my takeaway. Now, look, put it this way: if anybody wants to provide me credible evidence that's not coming from Twitter about Poilievre's wife, I mean, by all means, my inbox is open. But I've seen zero credible evidence for this. This is firmly in the range of deranged conspiracy theory at this point. I mean, I'm open. Man, I'm a journalist. If you can give me a scoop, give me a scoop. But to me, this is fever dream shit.
I'm having a hard enough time not throwing up already. I'm not opening my inbox to all of Twitter.
The other thing, the last point I would make on the Foreign Inquiry Commission is just, how should I say this? The reason why this thing is going to be dead on arrival is very clearly listed out in their recommendations. Among their recommendations, more funding for mainstream media, based on the evidence of the Department of Heritage. Bringing back the one vote subsidy, subsidy. I mean, create a censorship agency to deal with disinformation. Of course, disinformation always defined by what interests the people who are controlling the agency for censorship. I mean, this shit is absolutely dead on arrival. Hard no. And to me, it betrays the sort of lack of dispassion of Justice Hogue. Like, it discredits the report that these sorts of ideas are even being entertained in this context. If you want to make an argument for more funding for mainstream media, I mean, again, we've been arguing against this to death for a very long time. We at The Line do not take government funding, and we don't think that creates a healthy ecosystem. Virtually every single mainstream media organization in this country is funded to a serious and extensive extent.
And growing extent.
By government subsidy. We're creating and propping up a zombie media industry in this country as a result of that. And at the same time, undermining the faith that people have in this. But again, it goes back to the cultural issue. The answer to a decay in trust in Canadian institutions is never, force the institutions to be more transparent or behave in a more trustworthy way. The answer is always, no. I'm the intellectual elite here, and you have to do what I tell you, and I'll lecture you harder to trust these institutions harder.
Yeah.
To me, it just speaks right into that mindset that is fundamentally corrosive and cancerous.
We haven't Canadian institutioned hard enough.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you want to make an argument for bringing back the one vote subsidy? Okay, make an argument. You shouldn't be doing this in a foreign inquiry report. This should not be a vehicle to bring back your own personal pet policies. And no, we're not going to be creating a censorship agency to deal with disinformation. Fuck you. Go read some Milton. I mean, like, I don't even know where to begin with that. Like, to me, that's just, you have to be pretty ignorant about some pretty basic tenets about the problems with censorship to even be entertaining that in this context. And how in the world are you making an argument for more government funding for the very mainstream media that are promoting the very leaks that you've just chastised us all for promoting? Like, half this entire report is an attempt to chastise the mainstream media for spreading disinformation and torquing, and yet very conveniently you think that funding us more are the problem. Like, this is incompetent. This is inherent. This is not incompetent, just the wrong word, but this is incoherent, is what I would say. So as I said, I think that this, as on the big picture stuff, the foreign inquiry stuff is broadly correct. There's no evidence that our system has not been able to withstand the attempts at foreign interference. We can trust that the results of our elections are correct. There have been some failures in communication. It would be putting it mildly. There are some things that we can continue to do to harden our democratic institutions. I think that those broad ideas are correct, and Hogue is correct on those things. Everything else here is a bit weak. It's poorly. It's poorly argumented, and it's poorly argued. The recommendations are weak, and bluntly, I mean, there's no reason for us to trust Hogue's judgment over anybody else's, considering we don't have the evidence to make assessments for ourselves.
To me, and again, I'm deferring to you on this one because you did the heavy lifting, but ever since the very beginning, to me, the foreign interference inquiry and the whole issue writ large, everything from the initial allegations through Johnston to here, has been alongside the pandemic, alongside the convoy, alongside the invasion of Ukraine, October 7th, the re-election of Donald Trump. These are all foreign bodies, and no pun intended on foreign interference, but just as a guy who's currently laid low by a virus, these are all viruses attacking the Canadian immune system. And I keep waiting to see an immune system response from our government. And I'm not wild with what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
And it's just been one of the themes in recent years. I would never say I was long on Canadian state capacity, but we've had such a bewildering, almost variety of different kinds of crises in recent years. And I'm not seeing a ton of evidence of, well, you know, we're bad at this, but we nailed this.
No, instead it's we could do a little bit better, but really the problem is you, citizen, for not trusting us harder. It's the same answer every time.
We got to find an eminent Canadian or a retired Supreme Court justice to tell us that everyone was doing their best.
Yeah.
And really, who are we to expect any better? And I'm just looking around the state the world is in. We were talking in our last podcast, right? Asshole Nation, Maximum Canada, whatever you want to call it. Not seeing any sign of it. I'm not seeing that immune system response. So,
yeah. On that note, I think I've been rambling on for a good 30 odd minutes on like a foreign interference inquiry. Look, this is available online. You as a listener or reader,
800 pages.
It's accessible. Like I'm not going to claim that I sat down and like perfectly read through every single paragraph yet because I haven't had time to do that with my, dental issues. But I would really encourage individuals, go read it for yourself. Go make your own assessments on this stuff. The Canadian government doesn't trust you to be an adult human being, but I do. And I think that you should go and read this thing, download it for yourself, come to your own conclusions on it. Your conclusions may be different from mine. That's fine. But it's there and you can check it out. On that note, like and subscribe to the line.
Like and subscribe. This message brought to you by TikTok Canada. There was news out of the U.S. last week when President Donald Trump intervened to stop the shutdown of TikTok. As we speak, our neighbors to the south are crafting solutions to keep the app alive, saving thousands of jobs and billions in economic benefit. The Canadian government has an opportunity to do the same, saving hundreds of good, well-paying jobs and millions of investment in Canada, all while addressing security concerns. Shutting down TikTok Canada doesn't make Canadians safer. Instead, it drives jobs and investment out of Canada. Urge the government to do the right thing and stop at the shutdown of TikTok Canada. This message brought to you by TikTok Canada. So, I got through a segment.
Yeah, but there's one thing I totally forgot to mention from my notes from the foreign inquiry stuff.
Oh,
Just this fun little, it's just fun, funny little anecdote.
Okay.
And that was, Justice Ho got onto the screen and I was watching it through CPAC. And after gently chastising the government for demonstrating lack of transparency and needing to communicate more, very gently, the press conference came to an end. And she said, "And I won't be taking any questions because the report speaks for itself."
Thank you, Justice Hogue.
To me, that pretty much summed up Canadian officialdom in one little anecdote. Look, I want to talk about Mark Carney.
There has actually been first of all, I want to just brag that I got through an entire segment with Noro and I was fine. Now, I will let the listeners know that we took a 5-minute break in between segments so I could go lie down. But other than that, this podcast is killing it. We are
doing great.
Want to know one of the incredible things of living in the year 2025?
Tell me.
I ordered restorative food and drink via Uber Eats to my house.
Yeah.
So I was able to eventually drag my butt downstairs, look in the fridge and see what was there. And I'm like, I ain't eating any of that. So I ended up eating instant noodles and drinking Gatorade, and Uber Eats brought that to my house. So thank you to Farouk, I think his name is, for dropping that at my door. And it's great to be alive, if we call this living, in 2025. There has been developing news on Liberal leadership, Mark Carney stuff, even while we've been recording today. I don't know if you've seen this yet.
I have not seen it.
You might have seen it, but Dominic LeBlanc, the new finance minister, I should say, has announced that the capital gains tax changes are now officially punted. They're being deferred into future tax years.
Because literally the CRA can't charge you taxes on something that's been proposed but not passed through Parliament, because that's contempt of Parliament. So, yeah, there's that.
So, as more than one smartass on Twitter noted, I was too weak this morning to be one of them, but I did observe some of them with mirth. It's a good thing to discover that generational fairness will not be an issue until 2026. We've got a year to sit on that one. No problem at all. This government for the last couple of years has, especially the last year and a half, has been like sketch comedy government. And
it's been a little SNL-y, huh?
They're just like what we're seeing with Carney, and we'll talk about this in a minute, what we already have seen with Freeland, what we're seeing just this morning with the capital gains tax. This government cannot possibly hold up under the weight of its own incoherence and contradictions. And it is belatedly, I guess, figuring that out. Good job, everybody.
Every week that goes by that Mark Carney doesn't put a pin in something resembling an actual policy position makes me angrier. Like it increases the rage in my heart. So I was happy to see that Mark Carney appears to have taken a position on the carbon tax, at least. He has announced, or he's been badgered into announcing, that he would lift the consumer-facing carbon tax and rebate. That essentially he would keep some kind of carbon tax in place for large industrial emitters. And he's going to implement something called a carbon border adjustment.
Oh, could there possibly be another term that would describe such policies?
Another term that rhymes with tariff. Okay, so Matt, I'm going to start this segment by giving you some down-home folksy wisdom.
You do that so well.
I do that so well.
You really speak to the people.
I really feel like this is advice that my stepfather gave me.
Jen chugs $200 of nitrous and then gives down-home folksy wisdom.
Yeah, true. At least nitrous uncovered by my terrible insurance policy. Go being an entrepreneur. So my stepfather, this is BC, not Alberta, but you can pretend it's Alberta if that suits you, gave me some great advice when I was a teenager. You know what he told me? He said, Jen, most issues just aren't that complicated. There are some exceptions. Rocket science, quantum theory, like there's some really out there stuff that you genuinely need, like a 140 plus IQ to be able to process appropriately.
Yeah.
But like 90% of issues can be understood at a basic level by anyone with a high school diploma, realistically.
Don't tell Commissioner Hogue that, but yes.
I mean, honestly, that's just the reality. I'm not saying that someone with a high school diploma will necessarily understand or become an expert in the ins and outs of every single policy issue, but I'm saying 90% of people who can pass a high school diploma exam can understand at a basic level 90% of the major issues facing us today, 90% of the time, is kind of the way that I would phrase that. And my father said to me, Jen, you're as smart as you need to be. Like, bluntly, like, you know, he didn't say, like, look, you ain't going to be a rocket scientist, but he's like, look, you're as smart as you need to be.
You've peaked, and it's fine.
It's fine. You were a cheerleader for 5 seconds. It didn't work out for you. You had other gifts. You were in choir. That's fine. That leads me to another piece of advice my stepfather gave me that was bad advice, so I'm not going to repeat that here. But, so he said to me, and this always stuck with me as being really, really good advice. He said, if you can't understand what a person is telling you, unless you're talking rocket science or quantum theory, if you can't understand what a person is telling you, either that person is not communicating it very well or can't communicate it very well, or that person's trying to pull one over on you. That has proven to be emphatically true in my life, almost every single time. If I can't understand what a person is talking about, either I'm dealing with someone who has challenges with communicating through verbal language, usually because they're so brilliant, or they think in verbal in images, and they struggle to communicate that in a verbal way. In which case, it's kind of on me to try and reach through and make that translation happen, which does happen, but it's not malintention. Or someone is essentially trying to throw one over on you. Someone's trying to fuck with you. Someone's trying to head fuck you. And what I found that really valuable advice is that forever inoculated me against a really common problem that I see in people. And that is people often, ordinary people, ordinary, reasonable, or even high intelligence, will look at people that they know are smarter than them. They look at the individual like, I know that guy's smarter than me. I know that guy knows more than I do. And if that person is spouting gibberish, their impulse is to smile and nod.
Yeah.
Because they assume that if they don't understand what that smart person's saying, the problem's with them.
It's because they're too stupid to understand it, and they don't want to admit that.
And they're too insecure in order to admit that that they're not following along. And that allows a lot of smart people to get away with doing some really shitty things. Mm-hmm. So I impart the wisdom of my stepfather to all of you. If you don't understand what a person's saying, you have to ascertain, is that because the person is not communicating effectively enough? Or is that person spouting goddamn gibberish and expecting you to sit down and shut up because they know they're smarter than you? And I've been thinking about a lot when reading pretty much everything Mark Carney has to say about his carbon tax. Because a lot of what he's saying about his carbon tax seemed to me to be frankly gibberish. He was asked, for example, a pretty straightforward question about, well, look, if you're taking away the consumer side of the carbon tax, but you're keeping up the tax,
which he did say today
emitter.
He will do. He said it's no longer working. We're going to get rid of the consumer carbon tax.
Okay, that's good. That's a direct policy position. Thank you. My rage level was diminished a little bit. But he was asked pretty directly, well, like, look, if you're keeping the large emitter carbon tax, what's to stop the large emitters from just passing those costs on to consumers? Like, you still run into the compounding effects problem. He couldn't give a straight answer to that. And I'm sorry to say this.
What I said last week? We're going to synergize the optimized efficiencies?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, he gave a gibberish answer to that. There's no straight answer to that. And that's because, of course, it will. Basically, what will happen if you continue to tax large emitters is one of two things. The large emitters will be incentivized to reduce their carbon emissions in order to maintain competitiveness, and some of them will. And then what they can't reduce, they'll pass on to consumers. That's the answer. Like, that's how a carbon tax works. And he gave an absolute roundabout answer that was absolute gibberish on that particular point. And to me, I don't know if that's because he lacks experience as a professional communicator. Oh, gee, there's that experience word coming up again. Or if he's just trying to pull one over on the assumption that he's smarter than the reporters who are questioning him and smarter than most of the people listening to him. I can't answer that because I don't know what's in his heart. But I thought that was interesting.
Deep. It's very deep.
Real deep. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, like, he's talking about this quote unquote carbon.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry,
let me just respond to that point first.
Mm-hmm.
Your stepfather gave you good advice. I don't know what the terrible advice he gave you is. I'll text you later to find that out.
I'll share it if you want the terrible advice. Do you want the terrible advice? No, it's funny.
Well, okay, go ahead.
He said, boys like cheerleaders more than they like girls in choir. Stick to cheerleading. Quit the choir.
It's not wrong.
Yeah, but it was, in my case, terrible advice because I was a terrible cheerleader.
Okay.
I was really bad at it.
That's different.
Like, it didn't take the actual individual personalities into account. Let's just put it that way.
Understood.
And I also went to high school like in the 90s and 2000s. By the time I was there, like, boys wanted the volleyball players, not the cheerleaders. But that's a whole other conversation.
There's always room for a cheerleader. And we shall move on from that. So your stepfather's first batch of advice was good. But there is a, not disagreement, there's a corollary I would add to that as well. It's something I've seen in people. Even if they're not trying to fool others, people sometimes try to fool themselves with complexity.
Okay. Sure.
Because apply a simple analysis and framework to a situation, and it leads you to an unpalatable conclusion. And rather than accept it, you go, we must reassess. Or what we have not factored into this is this other thing. Or, but what if we include this variable? And people just spin out massive reams of bullshit that are all to kick the can down the road before they have to make the original unpleasant decision that they knew pretty quickly was the right one. And now it's much worse because of the delay. That's the Canadian federal government in January 2025. We have kicked the unpleasant unavoidables to the point where, look, even liberals these days, they're not saying it publicly, but talk to some of them off the record or on background, they're all wishing this had gone differently. And it's not like they weren't warned, but rather than go, we're a 10-year-old government with a prime minister who's become deeply unpopular, heading into a very difficult economic circumstance, they went, well, there's the Hogue Commission, where Donald Trump will save us. Instead of looking at it as a simple thing, you're a 10-year-old government in terminal polling decline, they made it hard. Okay. There we go.
So the other plank of Carney's, frankly, slightly half-baked position on this is he's going to create a green incentive plan. Okay, that's fine. I really look forward to seeing the people who criticize Erin O'Toole's green incentive plan criticize Mark Carney's. That'll be very entertaining to me, but that's another matter for another day. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the quote-unquote carbon border adjustment.
Tariff.
Yeah, so all the criticisms
You're from a high-emitting country, we will impose an import levy on you that will, I don't know, I mean, I guess we'll have to see how they define it, but it could either go to general revenues or it could go to some mitigation fund for the third world. I don't know, but yeah, it's a tariff.
Okay, so a couple points. One, the great irony here is that effectively under the aegis of a carbon plan or a climate change plan, what Mark Carney is proposing is effectively the same thing as what Donald Trump is now proposing, or is now going to do. Okay, so you're going to tax incoming products that Canadians want to buy, thus increasing the cost of those products for Canadians. Except the difference is that where Donald Trump is going to take that and put it by his own admission, we'll see what he actually does, but Donald Trump is going to take those tariffs and he's going to reduce domestic taxes, right? So he's going to effectively use tariffs to shake up his own tax mix for Americans, for the benefit of Americans. Except what Mark Carney is proposing doesn't seem to do that. What Mark Carney is proposing is effectively a tax on top of the existing taxes for Canadians. Like, I don't see him talking about shifting up our tax mix or shifting up our tax incentives. Like, okay, so we're going to impose this carbon border adjustment tariff. And then we're going to reduce income taxes, or we're going to reduce the GST. We're going to be shifting our incentives a little bit in order to keep this revenue neutral, to keep our overall economic situation competitive. No, he's just going to impose a tariff on top of our existing tax structure, not call it a tariff. Okay. Fine. I would also like to make one other point about this, and here's where I think that, maybe having some experience in government would be an asset to someone like Mark Carney, because how is that actually going to play out in reality? Because you're now proposing that you're going to essentially put a tariff on a per country basis according to their carbon output. Mm-hmm. So that means you're going to be fighting 160 plus fights with 160 plus import or exporting countries to Canadians, all of whom are going to make the argument that they're doing this or that on carbon tax, and you're going to have to litigate them on a case-by-case basis. So as a practical
we'll have
matter,
to appeal to authority again and have some international group, which China will have outsized influence in, and Trump will refuse to work with it. Yeah, that's...
Well, so what you're even proposing here is a technocratic fucking nightmare.
Commissioner Hogue can go run it. No, I'm with you. Like, I get it.
So instead of actually just doing a clean, simple tax situation, or even a clean, simple... I mean, God bless Donald Trump. At least he's proposing something straightforward. It's 25% across the board plus exemptions. That's pretty straightforward. What Carney's proposing is going to be a nightmare to implement, because he's going to have to fight with individual countries, each one of whom are going to argue that they deserve the exemption based on the size of their population, the per capita carbon emissions, the particular tax incentives that they've put in place, and you're going to have to implement some kind of process.
Historical injustices, natural features that act as carbon sinks.
Good luck. Great idea, Mr. Carney. Fantastic. Really thought through this plan, haven't you?
No, and the funny thing is, I think we're moving into a global environment where the United States and China will not work together on these things. So what we will end up is a situation where Canada is trying to convene the nice countries to come up with some shared framework that neither the United States or China will want to get involved in. And meanwhile, the United States and China will be able to show up in these countries and go, we're not going to bother with this bullshit. You got coal to sell us? We're buying.
Yeah. So anyway, this, as I said, I was really hoping that Mark Carney, who came in criticizing the other guys for not having a plan, would over the course of 2 weeks be able to implement something resembling a sketched out plan.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I mean,
what he has proposed is dumb.
Let me also make just purely a political analysis here. I was telling you in the first segment that a lot of people were really rooting for the Hogue Commission because it was going to destroy Pierre Poilievre. He'd be seeking asylum in India by now, blah, blah, blah. There's something similar going on because you and I made a decision 2 weeks ago that we weren't going to talk about polling in a significant way for a month. So we got 2 weeks left to go. I'm simply going to mention that polling right now is erratic. Some polling companies are showing very modest tightening between the Liberals and the Conservatives, sort of what you'd expect if an unpopular leader said he was quitting. Others are showing massive game-changing swings, and I don't know yet what to make of it. In fact, on the first On the Line episode, we're gonna talk with someone about this. We can try to explain this to our us mere mortals. But let's talk politics for a second, because I keep hearing that the Conservatives are nervous, that the Conservatives are scared, that the Conservatives are afraid of Carney, and I don't think they are. I'm not even taking a stand on whether or not they should be. I could red team for the Conservatives how they lose the next election. I could tell them how they could be defeated. But I don't think they would believe me. So when I say they're not nervous, I'm not saying they have nothing to be worried about. I'm saying they're not nervous. Today, seeing what Carney has been doing, they're not nervous. Because it's exactly a situation where a party filled with officials who just spent years attempting to explain to Canadians, who are you going to trust, our chart or your lying eyes, and eventually began a phased retreat from that, first with fuel oil and the Atlantic carve-outs and the heating pumps, and now Freeland and Carney saying they're going to get rid of it. Karina Gould, God bless her, saying she's going to defer any future raises. Exactly what you and I said years ago was going to happen. The retreat became a rout. And one of the reasons they were never able to defend it is because they never came up with a really simple, clear way of defending it. It was always, well, 80% of households are going to get more in rebates and they're going to end up paying. And when I was a little bit occupied this morning, and I'll spare you all a description of what I was doing, but I did catch some of what Carney was announcing. And I'm thinking to myself, you're not going to be able to explain that. And you're handing the Conservatives something where they're going to be able to come up with, I don't even know if they're going to need to replace Axe the Tax. And I've heard from Liberal strategists, Carney coming in as leader takes away from Pierre Poilievre the two things that had been his greatest advantage. One of them was Justin Trudeau's personal unpopularity. The second was the deep unpopularity of the carbon tax. True, they've gotten or will be getting rid of the first. But on the second, instead of coming up with something like, nope, no carbon tax, or even Karina Gould, not raising it anymore, Carney's like, let's talk border adjustments. Something you and I have said often, and we've said it often about Chrystia Freeland, is that most of us aren't good at politics. And for most of us, that's fine. We don't have the intuition for it, the instincts, the charm, the charisma. We don't have the guile for politics. And that's okay. The only people in the world who need to be good at politics are the politicians. And if you're not, that's a problem. Mark Carney hasn't face planted yet. He hasn't done something spectacularly stupid that has ended his chances, and he's just going to go home and drink a Bud in his Oilers jersey and cry. But he's not showing me yet that he gets the kind of political fight he's going to be into. Because one of those other little news stories today that was out, that I was able to briefly glance at between other commitments, was the Conservatives have announced like a record-breaking fundraising haul.
Yeah, $41 million.
The Conservatives have an absolutely astonishing amount of money. And they're already starting to roll out Define the Enemy ads against Mark Carney. And some people point to that and go, oh, they're nervous, they're scared. They're not. They're just shifting all their artillery from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney. They're not even bothering with Chrystia Freeland. They've decided she ain't going to be it. I don't know if they're aware of the existence of Karina Gould. They're shifting all the big guns from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney. And if you don't think the Tories were panicked about Justin Trudeau 2 months ago, you can't make the argument that continuing the exact same tactics against the successor constitutes panic now. I just don't buy it.
Okay, so Matt, you've just offered a really cogent political analysis here. I want to offer something that's not about a political analysis. I'm just going to make this point. Mark Carney's whole appeal is that he's so smart and so beyond that he uniquely has like the intellectual heft and weight to carry the country through this really difficult time.
He's hung out with kings, presidents, and prime ministers.
Right. Okay. So the only policy he's announced in 2 weeks is dumb. And he's supposed to be so much smarter than me that I shouldn't be able to pick apart the very obvious problem in the policies he's announcing. What am I to conclude from that?
Like I said a minute ago, this is
carbon border adjustment. I mean, literally 30 seconds after hearing the term, which by the way, he hasn't even really bothered to explain or defend in any meaningful way.
Explaining's for losers.
That isn't total gibberish. But like just the concept, you and I were able to point out what the problem with that was going to be. Isn't Mark Carney supposed to be so much smarter than us? Isn't he supposed to be like next tier genius level? Like my own stepfather put it pretty cleanly, like you're smart enough, but you ain't a rocket scientist.
For the record, I wouldn't put it that way.
Look,
if you're looking for masculine validation, I think you're all that and more.
Yeah, okay, but I'm pointing out here that if the whole appeal of Mark Carney is that he's next tier super genius.
Segment 2, Jen's stepfather and his advice.
Well, look, I'm not going to talk about how he ran off with the secretary, okay? But look, I'm just saying, this is carbon border adjustment. This is your 150 IQ shit, huh?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Right. Moving on.
I think to the extent that we can kind of wrap a bow around all of this, it's kind of a combination of what you and your, I guess now former stepfather had been saying, kind of what I was saying, which is Chrystia Freeland seems to have actually drawn the correct political conclusion. Carbon tax is dead. We're not doing it. Mark Carney doesn't want to make that decision yet, so he's complicating it. He's not, and I know Freeland is going to come up with some environmental plan eventually. It's probably going to be dumb. But I think she has the better read of it politically. And there is a weakness anywhere. But I think it's particularly ossified in Canadian public policy circles now of if we ain't winning, we haven't complicated it enough yet. The solution to this proposal is to add more widgets and bells and whistles and doodads to it. Whereas the correct conclusion, and I don't like this, but I have to acknowledge it, is axe the tax. Axe the tax, axe the tax, axe the tax, verb the noun, build the home, stop the crime. There is this great thing from The Onion. The Onion did Our Dumb Century, where they did like a book that was like one front page from every year of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And in 1979, they were covering the debate between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And there's big smiling headshots of both of them. And Carter's statement for his article is, "Let's talk better gas mileage." And Ronald Reagan's is, "Kill the bastards." So
I still think axe the tax is going to be a very dated
I
idea.
agree.
I don't think it's going to be dated enough that they're not going to win on it. But like,
even, okay.
here's the thing.
Carney's fighting them on their chosen territory.
That's true. Okay, yes, that's true. That's true.
So if he could bypass that. He could go, look, environmental policy is something that's going to be key to this government. We're going to work on it, but we have to first navigate this emergency with Donald Trump,
true.
and I'm laser focused on that.
That would be the way that the Liberals could win it, for sure.
Instead,
not win it, but they're
trying to complicate it, so that they can salvage the policy that Mark Carney doesn't emotionally.
And they're doing it, and you're right, and they're doing it on the conservative zone preferred framework and framing.
They're gonna win if you do that.
Well, they're going to probably win if you don't. But look, I mean, you and I have been saying, and I think this is true, the axe the tax shit is going to be increasingly out of step with where Canadians want their leaders to be. But that doesn't mean it's not going to win.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, there you go. And
ship's been going at this speed and on this heading for a while.
I get it. They've already done the signs and the T-shirts have already been made up. It's really hard to just put that stuff back in a box now. I get it. Look, I think that's all I have to say about that. We do want to talk about Trump tariffs. Do we want to take a break here, or do we want to just roll in? Okay,
yeah,
all
we'll
right.
take a break. I gotta go lie down for another 5 minutes.
There you go. Like and subscribe to The Line. Check us out, www.readtheline.ca.
This message brought to you by TikTok Canada. With looming U.S. tariffs, Canada must send a signal we are open for business. Unfortunately, the potential shutdown of TikTok's Canadian offices does exactly the opposite, creating a chilling effect on tech investment in Canada. Imagine all the jobs and investments we could lose at a time when we need them the most. Right now, the U.S. is working on a solution to keep TikTok. Why aren't we? Canada has an opportunity to demonstrate that we're open for business while addressing security concerns and fostering a thriving tech sector. Shutting down TikTok Canada doesn't make Canadians safer. It just drives jobs and investments out of Canada. Urge the government to do the right thing and stop the shutdown. This message has been brought to you by TikTok Canada. Well, for those keeping score at home, that's 2 5-minute power naps in the middle of the podcast, but 0 throwing up. So I think I've turned a corner. Until I had to go read the news. So here's where we stand right now at time of recording. And esteemed and astute listeners will understand, and viewers, of course, will understand that shit's wild. Like I'm using technical jargon here, but shit be wild. Like I have no idea what's going to be announced today. But as of right now, U.S. sources and now Canadian sources are reporting that tomorrow, Saturday, February the 1st, Donald Trump is going to sign orders for broad-based, is the term I've seen, tariffs targeting Canada and Mexico. I don't know if broad-based means totality or if it leaves some room for carve-outs. I don't know. That's not clear at time of recording. However, there's a bit of nuance that's been introduced here. Apparently, these tariffs will not take effect until March 1st, so we'll have 28 days. One of the things, and I'm going to do something I rarely do here. I'm going to
I note that these tariff timing or the timing of these tariffs do not take the liberal leadership race into consideration in the least.
No, how outrageous! How inconsiderate!
Wow, how inconsiderate!
One of the things that you and I have heard directly every time we've talked about this is some variation of, or we could fix the border. That seems to be the term that's flying around anytime anyone criticizes Donald Trump for his plans. Oh yeah, well, we or you Canadians, if it's Americans, should fix the border. If there are problems on our border, we should fix them. And as we spent some time on talking about in the first segment, Canada's ability to defend itself is not something Jen and I have unrealistic understanding about. What I would say is that the border is not the point. Oil is not the point. The trade deficit is not the point. Tariffs are, as far as you and I can tell, a combination of a negotiating tactic to give America power, in line with, frankly, how Donald Trump has always negotiated, combined with a way of trying to fix structural deficit issues in the United States.
Yeah.
I think it's a stupid plan.
Yeah,
but I think it's what the plan is.
What's clearly emerging here is that Donald Trump has this idea that by switching up the way that America collects revenue, so moving into more of a tariff-based revenue system, he's going to kill two birds with one stone. He's going to try and onshore or friendshore more manufacturing ability, give Americans more jobs, more wealth, undermine and undercut his crucial sort of geopolitical competitors, especially China. Yeah. And at the same time, he's going to do all this while fixing or bringing in more tax revenue to sort of deal with America's structural deficits. So it's not to say that what we do will have no role, or that diplomacy will have no role, or that there's not things that we can do to respond. But, building this around the fantasy that this is just Donald Trump is really, really angry at fentanyl or something like that. That's the kabuki. That's the external stuff. That's the kabuki theater stuff. What's happening behind the scenes that he thinks that he can just he can get a lot of money out of this. There's a couple of points that I think are interesting. What's been announced here, it does sound to me like there will be an opportunity to carve out some exemptions for things like oil. And I suspect, at least initially, probably oil will be exempted because oil is a particularly important asset to the Americans. But I feel like I'm screaming into the sun whenever I make this point because people just don't want to see it. But like the idea that oil will forever be permanently exempted because America just needs it so much. No. Like I'm sorry to burst the copium on this stuff. Like I don't think that he will tariff oil right off the hop for two reasons. One, because that would increase oil prices at least somewhat. It would force a very significant adjustment from American oil producers, and they're going to scream. So I do think it's probably pretty likely that for some period of time we will have an exemption on oil. I think it's also totally possible that the Trump administration is so chaotic and so inept that they may kind of lose track of things. They may start bombing Mexico. Who the hell knows what happens 6 months from now? And they just kind of forget about it, right? I think that is absolutely a possibility. But we also cannot rule out the possibility that they're serious. They do want to tariff oil. They do want to cut the trade deficit, in which case they can. They can cut us out. Now, is it going to cost them? Yeah, absolutely. It costs probably hundreds of billions of dollars. Do you know what the profit of like the American oil companies is?
Not offhand, but it's lots.
It's hundreds of billions of dollars. That's pure profit. So the idea that they can't build a new refinery or rejig an oil route over a period of a couple of years, that's total fantasy. That's fantasy island shit. And by the way, even if they don't do it, because this is just a negotiating tactic, even if they don't do it because they just get distracted with other things, we as a country in Canada cannot continue to operate under the assumption that they wouldn't dare. I mean, this is a follow-up to the conversation we were having last week about asshole nation. Like, we have to operate under the assumption that we're dealing with an unreliable trade partner whom we've become radically dependent upon, and an unreliable trade partner who actually has the economic dynamism and cash to pull the rug out from under us. We have to operate under that assumption. I don't know what else to say here. Like America actually produces enough oil just domestically to be fully energy independent. They do. They export. They take our oil at a discount, right? And then they process it internally and they feed it into their system. And then a lot of the oil they actually produce, the lighter sweet crude that they produce, they can export at a higher profit. So they make more money because we're trapped into their system. So we're selling our oil at a discount to world prices that they can then value add, sell to themselves internally, and then export some of the excess that they produce. So they're making profits on both sides. This is a great deal for them. This is a fantastic deal for them. But will they sacrifice that great deal in order to prioritize other strategic considerations? Yup.
Or they might.
They might. Of course they could.
There's something strange about Canadians as a people. And they're probably not unique to us, but certainly it includes us. Where in almost any other context and any other field of human endeavor, hope for the best, plan for the worst is pretty good, banal, non-controversial advice. In Canada, it's like revolutionary, even offensive. I don't know if I have any cards left to play to make people realize their expectations are a problem. Like, short of climbing a clock tower and making a statement the old-fashioned way, I don't know what I can do. And I've told some colleagues this week. We got a note from a colleague in the media who had read something I'd written, and he said, "Hey, good job, keep fighting the good fight. Maybe you'll break through eventually." And I said, "Nah, I'm writing for history now. I've pretty much given up on the present." It's kind of a through line through all of our talks today. Foreign interference. We've shown no real desire to change or adapt or learn. Mark Carney wants to fight the Conservatives on the best possible terrain for the Conservatives with the stupidest possible policy recommendations. Here we are with a country so I was talking with a colleague just yesterday before the terrible things began, about the mood in Ottawa, an Ottawa-based colleague. And I was told it's weird, it's make-believe, if people are going through the motions. And in the background, as people go through the motions in public, they show up, they do their jobs. But the group chats are where the anxieties are coming out. And it reminds me a little bit, Jen, of early COVID. Is this thing really going to come here? Are we really going to get sick? Do we have enough masks? There's a lot of bargaining going on right now. And I agree with you entirely. I have no idea what Donald Trump is going to do. And on any given moment,
Donald Trump doesn't know what he's going to do.
It changes a lot. There could another helicopter, God forbid, could collide with a plane, and Donald Trump spends 9 news cycles doing that.
Yeah.
So who knows? But he might. And this is kind of like the Canadian version of hope for the best, prepare for the worst, is probably just a Poilievre-esque 3-word statement. But he might. And we can I keep hearing our $1 billion plan to fortify the border. Alberta has a new strike team. Ontario is working on one.
And by the way,
Feds have leased a couple choppers.
I think we also have to play the kabuki theater game.
100%. We absolutely do.
Fox News came up to the border here in Coots, and they did like a big thing. Oh, we're doing this to tighten the border. That is like, not to say we're not doing it, but that is 100% kabuki theater. That is 100% trying to speak to Trump's base that we're the people who are taking this seriously. Like,
saw the pictures of the officers lined up with their M4 C8 rifles. I guess
we're playing a perception game, and then there's the game behind the perception game. So. Okay, so we're going to go and do the tour for Fox News with the police lined up and the dog sniffers behind the border. Like, that's fine. That's fine. We have to play that game. I get it. But
But he might.
And and also, by the way, the perception game might not work. Like, the perception game might just fail. They may not care. It's not to say I say this when we were talking about Daniel Smith going to Mar-a-Lago. Like, someone has to go to Mar-a-Lago. Someone has to go and make those inroads. Someone has to keep those the lines of communication open. Someone has to do the work to sort of shift perceptions. We need someone doing that. It may not work, but we still need to try that.
I wonder what the overlap is between people who think Han Dong was unfairly criticized for speaking to the consulate in Toronto and that Daniel Smith is a traitor for going to Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I find that very interesting about the Daniel Smith criticism, a lot of people are criticized you and me for carrying water for Daniel Smith on this stuff. And I'm like, you should go read some of the stuff we've written about Daniel Smith in the past, because we've been critical of her.
In which case you shouldn't.
In which case, definitely don't.
Just skip that one.
But look, what annoys me about this one is that everybody who is criticizing Daniel Smith for going to Washington and going to Mar-a-Lago definitely knows everything she did and said there. like, was she secretly negotiating for the Alberta succession? Or was she potentially trying to make a case for not tariffing the oil? I mean, I don't know that she wasn't arguing for the secret succession plan, but I think
signing the documents.
But the most likely answer here is that she was going there, ingratiating herself, doing the charm offensive, building networks, building contacts, and making the case for Alberta oil. That's the most likely answer. So until you have some evidence that she's selling the country out, maybe we should not assume that, because if it weren't Daniel Smith doing that, we'd need someone to do it. And like Global Affairs Canada sure demonstrated that they ain't up to the task.
Well, I mean, Melanie Joly down in Washington this week, smiling with Marco Rubio, and
maybe she'll do another meeting with Lindsey Graham. He's really on the.
No, you know what?
I mean,
I'd beat up on Joly when warranted, but I don't mind that she's doing that. I think she has to be doing that. I think that's part of what we have to do. And I also think someone needs to be the Danielle Smith.
Someone needs to be the Daniel Smith making the inroads into Magaland, trying to figure out what the ins and outs on that are.
Like, that's really Team Canada. Like, that's like we use everything we've got on a 360-degree envelopment strategy, and we look for weaknesses and we exploit them. The idea that Team Canada is that we listen to the people who probably agreed with every one of Justice Hoag's recommendations and they set the tone, and disagreement is treason. I have concerns with that. Yeah. There's just, as again, a through line through all the segments here, these guys aren't coming off a record of success. Like, we're not in the middle of a national winning streak right now.
The other thing I would say is, like, if you were to provide actual evidence for me that Daniel Smith were planning the secret succession, yeah, then I think calling her a traitor is justified. But I'm not going to jump to that conclusion without evidence. In the same way, I'm not going to jump to conclusions about, like, I can only operate with the evidence that I have in front of me here. So anyway, that's just kind of, I'm glad someone from Team Canada is making the inroads with Magaland that need to be made.
Yeah, because everything we're doing might fail, and he might.
Or potentially you can't rule out the possibility that diplomacy will be successful. You have to try it. You know, as I said, I mean, again, I made this point last week, but if we were to come up with a Team Canada strategy from scratch, we would have one premier playing bad cop, one premier playing good cop, one premier making some inroads with the resistance. We'd have GAC be like a more neutral player operating within a more neutral sphere, right? And like this is kind of how we would would jam it. We're kind of falling ass backwards into a functional strategy. We're just not coordinating appropriately on it.
Oh, I agree we're falling ass backwards. I'm not convinced we're going to get a strategy out of it.
Well, anyway, look, I may eat my hat. It may be totally possible that Danielle actually wants to blow up Confederation, but I think we're going to have to operate on the evidence of our eyes before we run to that conclusion. And I also do think, by the way, if Canada does something really crazy, like tries to shut down the oil going south, I think all bets are off in terms of how she would react to that and how Albertans would react to that. But absent that kind of extremely high-level provocation, I'm not unhappy that there's someone in this goddamn country who can make a phone call to people in power in the U.S. and have that phone call picked up on the other end.
There's always, look, a rally around the flag effect is inevitable, probably in some ways healthy, but not to the extent it leads to strategic groupthink. That's the dumbest thing we could do right now. There has got to be someone in Ottawa at the Council Federation being the red team asshole going, well, but he might. And if he does, what do we do? And I've been alarmed this week to see the extent to which diversity is our strength stops being a thing the moment it is a diversity of opinion on how to respond to an existential threat.
Hear me out, Matt. Hear me out. Carbon border adjustment.
Look at you cheerleading for that. I've been waiting for like a segment to do that.
You know, sometimes it's good to understand your role in the world.
It's essential. And here we are.
Here we are.
I got to go lie down.
You got to go lie down. That is us from
But
line
you know what?
WW.
I think, like, I'm not here to toot my own horn here, except fuck yeah, I am. I did great.
You did fantastic.
Nailed it.
I didn't even glitch out of the matrix once today. All right. That's us. www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe here on YouTube, and also like and subscribe us over at Substack, because that's where we live.
And send me some Gatorade.